Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Recently, my wife and I, in our small group, have been reading through and talking about Genesis with our group. And, Genesis really talks about, I think, two main concepts, at least in the first couple of chapters. One of those is sin, and the other is kind of God's love. And I think they're kind of tied. And both are really critical to the Christian faith, but also like if you're of the Jewish faith or you're a Muslim. I think when we have things that are as fundamental as sin or as God's love, they can sometimes become hidden in plain sight or wrapped up in a platitude. So something like God is love. You hear that a lot. I think it's kind of a bad phrase because it makes some false equivocations. It makes God and love almost interchangeable in any instance where we have one, and it kind of takes God and it boils him down to love. And I think there's a real problem with that because God is more than just love, and love can't be understood without God. It should be something more like God is wholly loving and defines love. And I think when we look at something like sin, we ought to understand it as kind of like a distance or a divide that's created between us and our perfect God.
Well, I think when you say something like God is love, you have to kind of understand that God comes first in that equation. And I think what people do is they maybe backwards define that, where love is what they have an idea about what love is. And then they force God into like that box of what that means.
Sure.
But it's actually the reverse, where love as we know it and as we should define it should come out of how we understand God. God defines love. God is not defined by quote unquote love as we understand it.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you say that's one of the two things you get out of the beginning Genesis stories is sin. I mean, that one makes sense to me, but God's love, where do you get that out of the beginning Genesis stories? Or why do you say that as the second main point?
Well, I think we've got kind of a basis of God wanting the best for people and him creating all of these things and saying that they are good. And, even when human beings do sin, which we'll dive into a little bit more later, God is merciful in that, and he gives them clothing. So I see that as like a very loving thing. And I think, somebody asked on Twitter, like, summarize the Bible in, I think it was maybe like 5 words or 2 sentences or something like that. And the summaries that people were throwing out were like, you're sinful but loved, or you're flawed but loved.
Right. And those two components are key to the Christian life, is understanding those two things.
Well, that's a consistent theme throughout the entire Bible.
Yeah.
Every story can be viewed, at least in part, through that lens.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know that most people would immediately think about God's love when they read the first few chapters of Genesis. Like,
perhaps I'm reading it in light of the rest of the Bible.
Yeah, I'm sure you are, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I just think it's maybe a truth that's there that maybe isn't immediately apparent to people on the surface. Sure. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe that's just me. When I think of Genesis, I think of it as a story of beginnings. That's kind of, obviously, I mean, Genesis means beginning, right? Or the origin or something. But beginnings in the sense of Genesis is a very narrative book that introduces you to the arc of the entire Bible. And therefore the arc of all of history, all of humanity, and the arc of like your entire life even. It's a story of beginning of creation, and it's a story of fall, and it's introducing themes of redemption. And the whole Bible, actually, when you put it together, like the first 3 chapters of Genesis are actually pretty closely reflected in the last 3 chapters of Revelation. So it's almost like a beginning of this huge arc that constitutes the entire Bible and all of history and all of humanity. And I think that can be applied on a macro scale, but also on like a micro scale of an individual person in your life. Is this arc of creation, fall, redemption.
Yeah, I mean that creation, fall, redemption. I think you see that in individuals' lives.
Yeah.
You see that in like what we celebrate, right? We celebrate the beginnings of life. We celebrate the beginnings of marriages. We celebrate the beginnings of relationships and things like that. And there's usually some form of celebration or commemoration at the end of these things.
Yeah.
Those are kind of our markers. But then the reality component is that corruption, that sin, that in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, you could say like that fall part of that arc. That's the sin part that you were talking about.
Yeah.
One of the key things. I think you could probably say the redemption part of it is intertwined with God's love.
Well, I see the
part?
love through, like...
Yeah, the love is throughout.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is I think that creation piece, the introduction, the beginning of things, is maybe a third key thing that I see and get out of those beginning chapters of Genesis.
Yeah, I can see that too. Yeah, definitely. I think on those same lines, right, we have the beginnings of a bunch of different things, and one of the things that we have a beginning of is sin. And, basically everyone knows that Adam and Eve eat of the tree that they shouldn't, and then sin enters the world, and everything's all horrible and bad, right? And that's the fall of man. And, I think that that's definitely true, but I think that there's more to it as well. I think when you dive into it and you read something like Genesis, which I believe to be a more narrative than I think some other Christians, but one of the things that I think that you get out of a narrative reading, whether you believe that it's also literally scientifically true or not, I think that one of the things that you can get when you read it with a narrative perspective as well is Adam and Eve eating of that tree, which is dubbed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah, and why is it called that?
Right. Yeah.
What's the reason in the text for giving the tree that name?
Well, I think when the tree is named the knowledge of good and evil, I think that is human beings eating of that is them saying, I can decide what is good and what is evil. And this is after we've established that, like, God created all of these things. And there's a repetition of God saying, and this is good, and this is good, and this is good. And then he says, and it's not good for man to be alone. So here, initially, we see that God is determining what is and is not good.
Right.
And he's the one who has created this. And then we see humans going outside of God's purview and taking upon themselves a moral judgment, which is saying whether something is or is not good.
Trying to obtain that knowledge for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is us putting ourselves in the place of God, because God is who is supposed to be the one ultimately saying what is and is not good. And when we eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think, at least in part, that is a metaphor for us putting ourselves in the place of God. And I see that as, people will say that's the original sin. I think that's kind of the cardinal sin, and what all sin boils down to is us putting ourselves in the place of God and saying, well, I think this is good, or I think that is good. Even when somebody comes and says, like, let's say they put money as the highest thing. Like, implicit in that, we've talked about this before, but implicit in saying something like, oh, money is at the top of this value hierarchy is to be strived after, that is what's good, is an understanding that you can determine what is at the top of that hierarchy.
Or an assumption that you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because I guess the reason I asked that question about why does the text give that tree that name?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If this is simply just a scientific historical record of exactly what happened, you know, when God first created mankind, why does that tree have a name like that? You know? That's not a species of tree that we know of. It's clearly there's some deeper metaphysical or spiritual meaning behind it. And I think that's a really good sign that, like, when we're reading this text, we need to try and understand what it's saying at a deeper level.
Yeah.
You know, we can't just read it and say, oh, cool, Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and there was a snake, and now the snake crawls on the ground, and now they realize they're naked, and they have to cover themselves up. Okay, like, check it off as if it's a scientific text.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're doing the text a disservice if you do that, and you just stay in that realm. Because it's clear to me, and I think that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there's another tree in the garden, I think, that's called the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
Those are clear indications to me, like, there's something deeper you should be investigating in this text.
Mm-hmm.
There's something you need to understand here that's not scientifically explicit at the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when we dive into the little bit more narrative side of things, we get a better understanding of concepts like that. And, you know, one of the things I think some of the folks in our small group take a little bit more literal interpretation, which is fine. That's great. I think it's great to have different perspectives. But one of the things that we were talking about in small group was, like, what do we mean when we say sin itself? And I kind of posited that. And, you know, I think when we look at something like sin, we should understand it as creating that distance or divide between us and God. Not living up to his name, not living up to his image that we're supposed to. And we're not because we're going off on our own. We're putting ourselves in that place of God. You know, I think, I don't recall if it's the Hebrew or the Greek word for sin, but it was also oftentimes used with like hunters or archers in the context of missing the mark. So
right.
if you shot poorly, you sinned. You didn't live up to what you should have. You missed the mark. You sinned.
Yeah. And implicit in that is that this idea that there is a mark that we're aiming at.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're not just doing things that are either nice or mean or, you know, more on the good end or more on the bad end. Like, there is a target, a standard or an ideal that we should be aiming at
mm-hmm.
and trying to hit.
Yeah.
There's not just this is maybe getting into, like, moral relativism, but it's not just like there's relative good, bad floating all around in space. Oh, we can't really know. It's like, mm-hmm. No, there is a mark we're trying to hit.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And part of, if you think about it in that context, part of making sure that you don't sin, right, is on focusing on that mark and understanding how sin comes about and how to not sin. And I think it's only after we have a complete definition of sin that we can begin to analyze some of the ways that we can attempt to, like, mitigate that. I think that once we have that definition, you can kind of look at sin in a new way and kind of trace it back a little bit farther. Like, oftentimes I think we look at something and we try and prevent it at, like, the last minute. Right? And to me, that's like if, you know, you loosed that arrow and at the last second you were trying to, like, course correct once that arrow was already in the air to have it hit that mark dead on. Right? It's a lot more difficult to resolve the trajectory of that arrow after you've already let go of it, right? in some cases, it's maybe even impossible. This really reminded me of something that we use a lot in engineering, and it's dubbed the hierarchy of controls. Do you remember this?
I don't know.
Okay.
Not by name, at least, with you
Okay.
saying it right now.
Okay. So in the hierarchy of controls, at the very top, you have things that are highly effective at controlling a certain hazard, usually. Okay? So let's say you're in a kitchen and you want to make sure that you don't cut yourself with a knife. There are all sorts of different ways that you can prevent against cutting yourself with a knife. And at the very top of the hierarchy of controls, what's most effective is usually dubbed elimination. So it's the complete removal of the hazard altogether.
Not cooking something that requires you to cut anything.
Yeah, exactly. So not even being around something that...
Not owning knives.
Yeah, not owning knives, something like that. Now, you can obviously imagine, like, that's clearly going to be the most effective form of control. Like, oh, if there's no knife around, I can't cut myself with a knife. Mm-hmm. Then if you go one step down the hierarchy, right, it's less effective, and you implement the mitigative measure a little bit later. So the next step down is usually dubbed substitution, where you're replacing a hazard with something else. So let's say in this case, you're not going to dice tomatoes. You're not going to cut them up with a knife. You're going to buy diced tomatoes, and that still requires you to have something that is sharp. You still need to have like a can opener. You still have to deal with that can lid, but you've substituted that knife hazard with something else that's likely less hazardous. Then the next step down is dubbed engineering. So you're isolating the hazard to a certain area. You're engineering something out. I don't think that there's a great example for the knife thing here. Can you think of one?
I mean, you could have it like stored in some safe place where a child's not going to get to it or something. If your concern is a child cutting themselves.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. So those top three are where you're attempting to control the hazard. So you're trying to control, in this case, the hazard is the knife, because that's what would cut you. So you're trying to control the knife itself. Okay. That's kind of the category for those first three mitigative measures. Then the next three mitigative measures, that category is called exposure controls. And in exposure controls, you're not doing anything about the hazard itself, but you're trying to ensure that the hazard doesn't result in the negative effects that are possible. So the next exposure control is warning. So you're promoting awareness. You're saying, this would be like a warning label on the knives over in a corner.
So knife block, yeah.
Yeah, so like a kid doesn't get at that, right? And then one step down is administration. So you're managing behaviors. So in this case, you're saying be very careful with the knives every time that you're using them, and cut in a particular way to ensure that you're not cutting yourself, right?
Carefully teaching your kid how to cut with a knife.
Yeah.
We kind of transitioned to now we're talking about protecting kids from the knives.
I guess,
but yeah, maybe this applies better for the analogy.
So it'd be like, teaching the right cutting form and stuff like that. And then last up is PPE. So it's personal protective equipment, wearing some form of protection. So
wear those steel gloves.
Yeah, the chainmail gloves. I used to work at a place where you'd cut things, and we'd use the chainmail gloves. And I think that we can take this hierarchy of controls and we can apply that to sin, right? Because the hazard that we're trying to mitigate against is sin, and we can implement all sorts of different controls in order to effectively mitigate sin. I know that this sounds like highly technical, but the reason that engineering uses things like this is because it's effective. And, like we talked about earlier, the most effective kinds of controls that we attempt to implement are high up on that hierarchy of controls. They're eliminations of hazards, they're substitutions, they're engineering it out.
Yeah, so is this like what Jesus talks about when he says, if your left hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. So this is obviously hyperbole. Right. But the meaning of it is cut out the thing that's maybe causing you to stumble.
Yeah, run from sin. Because too often we take an approach to sin that's like of those latter categories. You know, it's something like protection or managing those behaviors rather than closer to the top, like removing the hazard or isolating it. That's the just running from the sin. That's cutting it out, right? And, you know, this can apply to like large things, like not putting yourself in like a compromising situation. If you're a recovering alcoholic, you shouldn't have alcohol in the house, right? Because let's say you're a recovering alcoholic, like having alcohol in the house, like, oh, we can put a warning on it, right? We can try and manage that behavior, but that's way down that hierarchy of controls. We want to be far up on that. We want to eliminate that hazard altogether. We want to not only remove alcohol from the house, we want to not even go by bars. We want to not go to like bar type places. We would like just remove that hazard altogether because that's something that is tough for somebody.
And I think probably before you even get to that point, you need to recognize the hazard that exists.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like if you don't recognize or sit down and acknowledge like, okay, these knives that we have in our house, inherent to the nature of a knife is an ability to cut things.
Yeah.
And that can be used for good things, but there's a danger to it too.
Yeah, it's a tool.
So I think even as a person, you need to recognize that inherent in your nature that has free will, is this risk and this issue with sin. And that means a risk that in your choices you make, you could make a wrong one, or you could make one that is going to be separating you from God. And I don't mean separating you from God like, oh, you like sin holy, and now you're going to like lose your salvation or something necessarily. I'm saying like it does move you away from the standard God has set. And obviously as Christians, we know that Christ came and sacrificed for us to bridge that gap for us. But that doesn't mean we're free to just go continue living. So I guess I just want to clarify. When I say separate you from God, I'm not saying like God has separated himself from you because you've sinned. He gave you a pathway to him despite your sin. But we do need to recognize that within us, inherent to our nature, we have that ability to steer in the wrong direction. And because of that, we need to think about this seriously and how we safeguard ourselves against that hazard.
Yeah, and I think, you know, part of doing that, like you said, is that recognition. Like we should be viewing ourselves like an alcoholic views something, right? We're sinful. We're predisposed to sin. Everyone, you know, in some nuanced different way, but everyone nonetheless, right? And we should be doing the same thing that an alcoholic would be doing, which is managing that and trying to implement that kind of hierarchy of controls on our sin. You know, because problems come up when we do things that violate the stuff at the top. You know, the triggers or issues, I think, then kind of run their course, right? Like oftentimes, let's say you have like a lapsed alcoholic. Usually that happens because, oh, we went by or to the bar and you thought it was this trivial thing.
Yeah.
But it ended up being bigger than that. Something that I've been thinking about with that is that we're not trying to sin or get hurt. We're not trying to, you know, have like the alcoholic relapse, but we're not explicitly trying not to. And I think it's that focus on the good that I think is really critical. You know, I think it's kind of like Paul talking about doing things that he doesn't want to do and sinning. This is so often us. You know, we'll do something and immediately ask ourselves like, oh, why did I do that thing? Right? Like the alcoholic goes by the bar. Oh, I've got some friends in there, hangs out for a bit, and then is hungover the next day asking himself, well, why did I do that?
It's like, I know I don't want to, and I know I shouldn't, and yet I just keep finding myself do it. Like Paul, I think, talks about that struggle really, really well.
Yeah. And then, like, you do the thing, and you immediately realize after, like, oh,
I did it
I
again.
just did that thing. And I think my favorite example of this occurring is in the Gospels when Peter denies Jesus. Right? It's so clear. It's Jesus literally in front of him.
Jesus told him ahead of time.
He's told ahead of time.
You are going to deny me 3 times.
So he says, "I'll never forsake you, Jesus," who just turns around and replies, "You'll deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." Right? And then sure enough, he denies Jesus 3 times. And then, people come, they take Jesus, and Peter is questioned by like a bunch of different groups of people as Jesus is being questioned, right? Like they're separated, and Peter's sitting around the fire, and people keep bringing up like, "Aren't you that guy?
I saw you with him." Yeah.
And then sure enough, he denies Jesus 3 times, and the rooster crows. And then as the story as it's written in almost all of the Gospels, it says Peter then immediately realizes.
Right when he heard that rooster crow.
Right away.
Yeah.
Boom.
And you would think he should be on his guard against it, right?
Especially since he's been told.
Jesus told him explicitly this is what's going to happen. But I think it just goes to show that like you can know logically that you are predisposed to some certain sin, or that you struggle with this thing, or even in his case that it's going to happen and you should be on your guard. And yet you just still find yourself doing it. And he hears that rooster crow, and it's like immediately he realizes, and he just goes and weeps.
Yeah. And like that's us. We are so often like Peter. Like we'll deny Jesus in our actions, and then we'll feel terrible and convicted afterwards. And I think that's because like we lose sight and then we sin. After Jesus is taken, Peter, he's concerned with himself, not Jesus. He's concerned with what the people are going to do to him. Meanwhile, Jesus is off like having to deal with a bunch of stuff people are accusing him. Like he's lost sight of Jesus literally because Jesus has been taken away, but also figuratively because he's no longer concerned with like his friend, his Lord, and what replaces that? Concern about himself.
Yeah. He's trying to look out for himself. Yeah.
This is when the problem is introduced, I think. We lose sight of Jesus and we begin thinking about ourselves instead of him. This is when I think like true sin occurs. When we lose sight of God and we fill that gap with ourselves. This only really becomes like evident when that trigger comes along. Right? When those people ask.
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly what happened with Adam and Eve. Right? They lost sight of God's instruction to them.
Yeah, and that was the first thing.
Eve listened to the serpent. Yeah. They were listening to someone else. And they allowed that separation from God to come into the picture. And they eat the fruit. And then what does it say happened? Immediately their eyes were opened.
Boom. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, for Peter, it was people asking him who he was, and there was kind of like an underlying threat to his life, right? So then he gets concerned with himself. And then his sin comes to fruition in his denial, and he realizes when the rooster crows. And then in one of the Gospels, it says that he sees Jesus again. He refocuses on him. Like literally and figuratively, he sees Jesus being pulled out.
Oh, like they make eye contact or something.
Yeah. He makes eye contact, and then he just weeps because he realizes his sin, and he feels so terrible about it.
Well, and he's come again face to face with Christ, who is that ideal that we are compared against. And in the face of that, you realize like how you've fallen short.
Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about this, but, like, every ideal is a judge in a way. Like, you put a good painting right next to a bad painting. It's not saying anything about the bad painting. It's just self-evident.
Yeah.
And when we're so flawed and we see Jesus, it's self-evident how flawed we are. And I think it's this loss of sight, that's when we're sinning, right? It's like if we take the analogy of the basis of the word sin, right, to miss the mark, It's when you've lost sight of that target that you're going to miss.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like in sports, they always say, like, keep your eye on the ball.
Right.
Keep your eye on the ball. And that aim is what guides us. And I think, we've already created that gap. It just has not yet manifested itself when we lose sight of God. And it only becomes evident when some trigger comes along and we act on that sin. Like, we already have sinned. It's just waiting to come to fruition. There's one of our pastors who I would say talks a decent bit about, like, kind of anger management stuff. And I think that's like a perfect example for something like this. Like, if you take somebody who's really trying to manage their anger and not yell at their kids, if they're constantly remembering and meditating on, like, the love that they have for their kids and explicitly thinking about, like, not yelling at them and focusing on the good and being uplifting, then, like, if a glass drops and shatters because the kids are messing around, they're not going to yell at their kids because they're remembering not to yell and they're remembering how much they love their kids. Mm-hmm. It's when they lose focus and they get wrapped up in, like, the tasks of life that they forget. And then we're just waiting for the glass to fall, right? Like, the issue's already there. It's already sown in that person. We're just waiting for that trigger to come along, waiting for that glass to fall. And then it becomes manifest and the person blows up and is angry, right?
It's interesting you use the word remember right there, because I think I've talked to you about this before, but as I've been reading through the Bible that I've been trying to do this year, like, I'm reading it cover to cover in order, which I've never done before, but a big thing that's been standing out to me is this theme of remembrance. Remember or not forgetting comes up all the time. Especially,
remember the Lord your God.
Stood out to me in the Old Testament just over and over again, reading about the Israelites continually falling away from God. And they use this word or this phrase a lot of the Israelites, they did not remember the commands of God, or they didn't remember what God did to bring them out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And it's contrasted with, time and time again, God remembering his people. The Bible says God remembered Noah. God remembered the Israelites. God remembered the covenant he made with his people. And he continually has that in his mind and is acting in remembrance of all these things. And the Israelites are constantly falling out of remembrance of God. And time again, what they have to do is they have to be reminded of what God has done for them.
Yeah.
And they have to remember how in the past he's been faithful to them. Because when they lose sight of that and they forget, that's when they stray.
Yeah. Yeah, like, if we go to our, like, aim analogy, they've lost sight of that target, right? And you're kind of, like, continually shooting arrows.
Right.
Right, in the analogy. So you're off, you're sinning.
Just
you have to, like,
over and
refocus
over.
that effort. Yeah. To bring it back. Focus on that bullseye. Yeah, I think it's really when, like, we lose sight of the goal, we lost sight of that prize. The same thing happens when we're losing sight of God. Like, losing sight of that prize is a prerequisite to failing. Once we have this understanding of where that sin comes from, and we have an understanding of how to manage certain hazards, I think it gives us something that is a lot more tangible, right, to combat some of those things, so that we can address the stuff like when Paul says, like, I keep sinning even though I don't want to. We can start looking at certain things, like in that hierarchy of controls, and apply that to certain very tangible things in our lives. So, like, if we think about that glass example, if a glass falls, you may think it's just because, like, somebody bumped the table and made that glass fall. And while that may be a contributing factor, that's one of the things. just saying, oh, well, make sure nobody bumps into the table isn't a great way of preventing that glass from falling, right? Like, because accidents happen. A more effective control measure would be to put the glass like closer to the center of the table so it doesn't fall on the ground if like the table is bumped. Like tables get bumped all the time, especially when you've got kids in the house. Like there's some level of responsibility for the person setting the glass down or for a parent to ensure that the glass is in like a reasonable position. I think we need to do the same kind of thing when it comes to sin. Like we need to understand what problems or means of sinning we're predisposed to, right? If you're predisposed to being short with your spouse, if you're predisposed to, becoming irritable, you should understand what things are causing that and try and eliminate those things rather than just let me try and hold it in when I get angry. And you should focus on not just preventing the negative thing, but also focusing on that positive thing. Like when I was talking earlier about like the kids knocking over a glass, like if you're focusing on how much you love your kids, you're not going to like be screaming at them in anger because you're focusing on how much you're loving your kids.
And the reason you do that is probably because you've lost sight of that.
Yeah. And like if you're focusing on loving God, I think it really is when we lose sight of that, that we sin, that we stumble. I think it's so poetically represented with Peter, I think. Like that's us. Part of what we're trying to do here is undo and put behind us that original sin, that cardinal sin of putting ourselves in the place of God. I think when we put God in his rightful place, right, like at the forefront of our mind, and we focus on that, to me, that's putting that apple back on the tree. That's saying, no, this isn't for me to decide. I'm not the one to decide where to shoot. I'm not the one to decide where to focus my efforts. I'm going to focus my efforts on exactly what God says I should, on that target. I'm going to focus my efforts on him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a decision that we have to make daily. That cardinal sin is a daily sin.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I do think there's something painful and difficult about doing that, but there's also something freeing about it.
Yeah, right? You have to let go.
Yeah.
Of some of that control.
Jesus says, "Come to me. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." There's a freedom that comes in laying down at the feet of Jesus and submitting yourself to him and like having that trust in what God says, that what he says is true, and I know that. And relinquishing some of that control, that's a difficult and painful thing to do.
Yeah.
But there's a release in it, and it's no easy task, but I think you can find rest and assurance in it. When you remember God and who he is, and you remember all of the good things he's done, and you keep your eyes focused on the character of who he is, and he is love and he is grace and all the good things he's done. And remembering that, I think can help ease some of the difficulty of being able to submit to him.
Yeah. I think we need to focus every day on, figuratively putting that apple back on the tree, focusing on God and having faith that he has like everything that we need. And I think that this is kind of humorously depicted in Kanye West's Everything We Need from his album Jesus is King. It says, "You gonna do what Adam do? Or say, baby, let's put this back on the tree, 'cause we have everything that we need." Let's do exactly that every day and put God in his rightful place. Well, it's getting late, but recently I've been listening to some of the songs that I have been tweeting in a thread of good Christian songs. I didn't really grow up in the church culture, so I don't think they're tainted by too much nostalgia. But one of the songs that I really like is Passion by Hillsong Young and Free. And in the song, there's a repeated phrase at one point during the bridge that says, "I found you," referring to God. And it always reminded me of like kind of a lost kid in a supermarket, and they find their parent, and the kid exclaims, "Oh, I found you, I found you." And the reality is that the kid didn't find the parent, right? Like the parent came and found the kid. The kid's efforts were like so futile. You didn't discover anything. That parent was pursuing you. And, I think that's how we are so often with God. One of my middle school or high school teachers used to say a phrase. The phrase was, "You are looking for what is looking." And I think so often we look for meaning, we look for purpose, we look for God. And we do that in so many wrong places, but God's looking for us. And from our perspective, it can kind of be like that kid in the supermarket, feeling like, oh, we found God. But I think it's good to remember that we are like that naive kid, fumbling around, looking for God. But He's been pursuing us with passion the whole time. Thanks everyone for listening. If you've got any thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Any topics you'd like to hear us address, feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.